So yesterday we looked briefly at the concept of a scalar product among vectors in a real vector space, and we wrote down many conditions which it should have. One of those important conditions was positive definiteness. Such a scalar product is generally called a Euclidean type of scalar product. Then we looked at the case of complex linear vector spaces, and there also for the inner product we wrote down certain mathematical requirements. It includes positive definiteness, and that kind of inner product in a complex vector space is usually called a Hermitian scalar product. That's a general name given to it. I also described to you some of the consequences of such a scalar product at the level of vectors. And in particular, we have the concept of two vectors being perpendicular to each other. We have the idea of the length of a vector, and ending up with the concept of an orthonormal basis. That also I described yesterday. For your guidance, that part of yesterday's discussion is on page 11 of these notes. We also saw that in a complex vector space with a scalar product, if you have one orthonormal basis and another orthonormal basis, the relation between them is given by a unitary matrix, unitary transformation. Today I would like to pick up from yesterday's discussion and go on to the consequences of the scalar product or inner product idea in a complex vector space for operators. Now, I will not write everything on the board as we agreed yesterday. I would like to refer you to pages 11 and 12 of the notes, but I will say something in words. Otherwise, I could have just sent it like notes by post and not come here myself and all. The most important ideas at the level of operators are the following. For any linear operator on complex vector space with a Hermitian scalar product, we have the concept of the adjoint of an operator. I would like you to appreciate the adjoint. Usually when you study matrices, you learn about the adjoint of Hermitian adjoint of the matrix. The rule is interchange rows and columns and take the complex conjugate. What I would like you to appreciate is that if you look at equation 53 on page 11, the concept of the adjoint of an operator is actually meaningful only if you have a scalar product given to you with all the standard properties, and then the definition of A dagger is given without talking about matrices or matrix representations. So I would like you to appreciate that the definition of the adjoint of an operator is an intrinsic idea. It requires the concept of scalar product. You may say, I have learned already that if I represent A by a matrix, I know how to take its dagger. But I want to say that is one level of understanding. What I am trying to communicate is a little more sophisticated. We must try to see things from a deeper point of view.
So just one question.
Yeah.
Yesterday statement you made regarding the transpose of a matrix being unique.
Say that.
Only, no, yesterday you said the transpose of a matrix is unique only if you define the inner product. So does it really mean instead of matrix operator? Because
I'm sorry, I don't quite understand the question. Please.
no. Yesterday you made a statement saying that
Analog to this in the real case.
yeah.
Yeah.
No, the idea of a transpose, you take that matrix just inverted row and column. So
Yeah, sure. So here is that I am using up a very precious resource, namely my time, but I want to clarify.
Let it be that matrix is an operator.
No, the question
Please arrange the ideas in the following way. The concept of a vector space is given to you, you have understood it, without thinking of a basis. A basis is a way to describe vectors in a vector space in a concrete way. But most of the definitions of vector space properties and operations are independent of any basis. Linear independence condition concept, does it depend on a basis? Linear dependence condition, does it depend on a basis? Linear combination, none of these depend on a basis. These are the concepts intrinsic to vector space idea. Once you introduce the concept of a basis, then vectors are describable in somewhat simpler way, more concrete way. Linear combinations, all of these things. Alright. Now, we have not yet talked about inner product. We just have abstract definition of vector space and we have brought in the basis concept. So take now an operator. Definition of operator is also independent of the basis. It has simple laws and anything which obeys those laws is called a linear operator. Now if you ask, how do I describe the linear operator A in a certain basis, there will be a matrix to describe it. Alright? Now, in the absence of scalar product, if you say, I take my operator, I take a basis, I calculate its matrix and I transpose. What is the result of that operation? You may think it is another operator. But that, what you are imagining, that new operator which you think you have found, is not just determined by the original operator. It depends on that and on the basis. That's what I like to emphasize. So, in the absence of a scalar product idea, the concept of the transpose of an operator is not defined on its own. So, understand? So, in the same way, in the complex case, the Hermitian adjoint or the dagger of an operator, let me not call it dagger of a matrix, I call it adjoint of the operator, is meaningful only if you have a scalar product idea in the complex case. Alright? Now, if you now introduce an orthonormal basis, and where does the idea of orthonormal basis come from? Only if you have a scalar product. Otherwise, you have no such concept. In an orthonormal basis, when you represent an operator by a matrix, its adjoint operator is obtained from the original matrix by interchanging rows and columns and taking the complex conjugate. So what I would like you to appreciate, now you were telling us that many of these things you don't teach at undergraduate level. But my purpose is, sir, if a few of you learn something new, you may not directly use it in your class, but it will be with you. Someday when you find a very bright student in the class, you may tell that student. Let us hope that will happen sometimes. There's a beautiful story in the Feynman volumes, the one on mechanics. There's one chapter called a special on the action principles. And he says that, you know that when he was college or school, what was it? College? School. His teacher, Mr. Bader, B-A-D-E-R, saw how intelligent, how sharp Feynman was. After the regular class was over, he took him to his office room and gave him a special lecture on the action principle. Now, first of all, we have to have a reasonable classroom to take a student. I really feel it very much that so many of our institutions will work with such difficult conditions. In the last 15 years, I am much more aware of it through the academy's efforts to try and help. But hoping that 1 in a million a bright student is there in your class, give her or him something additional, something special. That's all that we teachers can do. The only, punya that we can, the only good thing is we can do in life. So, it is in that spirit, even though what I am describing may not be directly relevant to your teaching, I would like to expose you to these ideas. Okay, so the definition of the adjoint is an intrinsic idea once a scalar product is given. And then you have the standard results which you should actually easily prove. The adjoint of the adjoint is the origin. Of course, it is trivial when you view it in the matrix language, but please see it in the way it is being defined without using matrices and things. In that language also, you must convince yourself A dagger equals A. And then, what about the dagger of the product of two operators, A and B? You get the product of the daggers in the opposite order. AB dagger equals B dagger AB. So you must verify these things. So, go beyond operations with matrices, learn to do it in this. Then we have in equation 55 at the bottom of the page 11 and going on to page 12, a few important kinds of operators. An operator is Hermitian if A dagger equals A. This is the complex vector space analog of something we define for real vector spaces. What was that idea? A symmetric operator. A transpose equal to A. This is the complex generalization. Then we have the concept of an anti-Hermitian operator. A dagger equals minus A. Right? This is the analog. What is it that this is? What is this generalization of? What did we have in the real case? Antisymmetry. Alright. Now, because we are using complex numbers as our scalars, there is some new property which we get, which we did not have in the real case. If an operator is anti-Hermitian, what can you say about I times that operator? I is square root of minus 1. Because our scalars are now complex numbers, we have the possibility of multiplying vectors, operators as well, by I or any complex number. If A is anti-Hermitian, I times A, what property does it have? Hermitian. So, in the complex case, these two situations are very close to each other. If you have an operator of this kind, multiplied by I, you get this kind. If you have this, multiplied by I, you go back to that. In the real case, there is no such direct simple connection between symmetric operators and antisymmetric operators. This is why in the statements I made yesterday, you saw, if you talk of symmetric real matrices, they have certain very nice properties. They can always be diagonalized by a rotation. If you have an antisymmetric real matrix, this cannot be done. At best, you can bring it to what is called 2 by 2 block diagonal form. Each 2 by 2 block is antisymmetric. You cannot bring it to diagonal form. So, in the real case, there are some roadblocks. In the complex case, things are easier, things are more uniform, properties are shared by more operators. So, whatever statement we are able to make for Hermitian operators, there will be a really similar parallel statement for anti-Hermitian operators. The third is the category of unitary operators. These are operators which obey A dagger A equal to 1. Now I mentioned a very simple problem which you can discuss in today's tutorials. You know that any complex number can be written as a real part plus I times its imaginary part. Every complex number. And my friend Professor P. Babu used to say, the worst thing you can do to a complex number is to separate it into its real and imaginary parts. The idea was you must learn to use and operate with complex numbers as a whole. Same spirit. Learn to think of operators, deal with them without going to matrices. If you can, you will find it much more power. So here I want you to convince yourself, and this you should check in today's tutorial, any operator in a complex vector space can be written uniquely as the sum of a Hermitian part and I times an anti-Hermitian part. It's easy, but you should do it if you have not seen it before. This is the analog of, say, any complex number has a well-defined real part and imaginary. Okay. So these are the three cases. Now the statement that one can make is the following, and many of those statements are given on page 12, equations 56, 57. I would like you to look at them at leisure. But the main thing I want to tell you, if an operator is Hermitian, it can always be diagonalized. By what kind of transformation? By a unitary transformation. Every Hermitian operator can be brought to diagonal form by a suitable unitary transformation. It's a very important result, very useful in quantum mechanics, you must appreciate it. Now we can make the same statement for anti-Hermitian. Every anti-Hermitian operator can also be diagonalized by a unitary transformation. Why? Because you just take the other case and put an hyphen. This kind of statement we could not make in the real case. Remember yesterday's statement. Real symmetric matrices can be diagonalized. Real antisymmetric matrices cannot be diagonalized. Here we have no such difference in the two cases. Of course, in the Hermitian case, when it becomes diagonal, all the diagonal entries will be real numbers. In the Hermitian case. What about the anti-Hermitian case? When it becomes diagonal, what can we say about the diagonal elements? What kind of entries will you have? In anti-Hermitian case. Huh? Huh? Yeah, pure imaginary. The real parts will not be there. Huh?
You can take I out and make it.
Then the rest will be real. But that means that if you take an anti-Hermitian thing and remove an I, the rest is Hermitian. So these two go hand in hand. Unitary operators, unitary matrices can also be diagonalized with the help of a unitary transformation. When that is done, what kind of elements will you get on the diagonal? The unitary case. What do you think we will get on? If A diagonal A is unity and A is diagonal, what do you think the diagonal elements will be? See, the diagonal involves not only transposition in the matrix, but also complex conjugations. No, more general than that. All the diagonal elements, each one can be some phase factor. E to the power I theta 1, e to the power I theta 2, and so on, all the way. So let us write here. When these, so first thing is to appreciate all these kinds of operators, Hermitian, anti-Hermitian, unitary, can be made diagonal. That is the most important thing. By a unitary transformation. When you make it diagonal, then in the Hermitian case, what can we say about the elements, diagonal elements? They will all be real. This one will be pure imaginary, the anti-Hermitian case. And the unitary case, all of them will be phase factors. Right? Which means complex numbers of magnitude 1. One last thing which is there in equation 57, this is analogous to what we saw in the case of real transformation, the real vector spaces. There we saw that if you have a real anti-symmetric matrix, then exponential of a real anti-symmetric matrix is an orthogonal matrix. This I have not proved. Today, if time permits, in the tutorial, try to do this. Exponential, you have to understand how it is defined if you are exponentiating an operator. It is an infinite series, and you have to learn how to handle it. In the complex case, the statement is, I will state it in terms of Hermitian operator because the two are related by a factor of I. So this is a very important result which you should understand well. Now I want to go on to something little more challenging, and let me make one comment in connection with equation 58 on page 12, because Professor Mani will be talking about special relativity very soon. In the context of special relativity, you know that we deal with 4 vectors: position, momentum, energy momentum, vector potential, and so on, which are have real components, and they are called 4 vectors in space-time. You are familiar with this. Now, suppose you have 2 such vectors in space-time in special relativistic context. There is a scalar product between them. You may write them in various ways. Our notation of yesterday is called the real domain. And depending on which way you use to define your metric, for example, you may write the scalar product relevant in special relativity in this form. Some people write it with an overall minus sign. They have plus for the space components and minus for the time components. So that's a matter of convention. What I would like you to appreciate is the following. This is not a Euclidean type of scalar product. You can have a vector x which is non-zero, but x with x may vanish. What are such vectors, 4 vectors called in special relativity? Suppose you have 4 real numbers x0, 1, 2, 3, such that x scalar product with itself is 0. They have a special name. They are called light-like 4 vectors. Supposing that x with itself is greater than 0, time like x with x less than 0 is space. Now, in Euclidean metric, the kind of scalar product I was discussing yesterday, all this thing can never happen. So we have to understand that in physical situations, we sometimes do have to use the idea of a scalar product among vectors, but it will not have all the properties that we assumed yesterday. Correct? So you cannot say, I am not going to look at non-Euclidean. You cannot. Special relativity requires that you look at it. Okay, so please remember that. So, among other things, if you can recall yesterday, this is called Lorentz scalar product or pseudo-Euclidean scalar product. It has the property of non-degeneracy. This is a subtle concept, but I will try to explain it. Suppose you choose x and keep it fixed, and suppose its Lorentz scalar product with all y is 0. For some x, its product with every y is 0. Then x must be 0. That property is true. It is called a non-degeneracy property. But it is not positive definitely. You may have a non-vanishing x mu. It may have 0 norm. So the concept of length becomes problematical depending on what metric you choose. For example, this one, time-like vectors, you can talk of their length. Space-like vectors, it will become imaginary. So you have to accept these things. Okay. Now I just am tempted to mention, just as we have this Lorentz type scalar product for real vector spaces, because special relativity requires it, and you give up this positive definiteness property, quantum mechanics by and large uses the complex scalar product which I have been discussing today morning, which also has positive definitions. And then it leads to concept of Hermitian, anti-Hermitian, unitary, and so on. But just as special relativity uses real vector space scalar product of a different kind, indefinite. Many years ago, Dirac, one of the founders of quantum mechanics, suggested that we should look at quantum mechanics in which this positive definite scalar product is replaced by something like Lorentz, but in the complex way. Okay, that is called pseudo-unitary. But well, he made this suggestion in a famous lecture in 1941 or so. Some people tried to use it in the research level, but it did not lead to many useful concepts. But I just want to tell you, as a mathematical idea, it exists. Just as you can take real Euclidean metric and generalize it in the sense of the Lorentz special relativity, you can take scalar product in a complex Hilbert vector space the way I have defined, generalize that also. Allow negative terms. And then it will become indefinite. But as I say, it has not found much use in physics. Okay, now, so far we have been talking about finite dimensional vector spaces and all the concepts that go with them. Now, at least briefly, I want to tell you something about infinite dimensional vector spaces. And I will deal only with the complex, okay, because that is where you have nicer results. Now, I am going to take advantage of the fact that I have given you these lecture notes. The material I want to refer you to is pages 12 to 19. Pages 12 to 19. Now my intention is not to go through all that material, but just pick up a few highlights, convey a few ideas, and then for such additional development, I ask you to read the notes whenever you have the time. First of all, when do we say that the dimension of a vector space is infinite? I think this idea I gave in the first lecture on Monday. Huh? When do we say that the dimension of a vector space is infinite?
For any n, we can have a number of elements, and we can have n plus 1, or we can.
Yeah, I think you combine, make a linear combination of your two statements, and it will be correct. For any n,
linearly independent.
n linearly independent vectors can be found, whatever n may be. Correct? So then you say that the space is of infinite dimension. There is no upper limit to the number of linearly independent vectors. That's the meaning of infinite dimension. When you have such vector spaces, then new problems arise, new mathematical points come up, which are really quite sophisticated. I myself have just an approximate understanding, physicist's understanding of these ideas. Whatever I know, I will hand over to you. I have written it here also. What will happen, and why should we look at it? Because quantum mechanics, in the way that you normally study it and teach it, involves such vector spaces. Suppose you are describing the Schrodinger equation for the hydrogen atom. Maybe that is done only at the master's level. Is that correct? Or never done in the undergraduate?
They do it for
Undergraduate? Third year. So that involves working with an infinite dimensional vector space. You may not be aware of it, but it is true. So I think a little bit of understanding of infinite dimensional vector spaces is useful. So what are the important notions want to give you a taste of the new features which come, about which one has to be extra careful. I will also confess, most of the people like myself, probably also personally trained in theoretical physics, we have not learned these delicate things about infinite dimensional space in the way we should. We have learned it like an engineer may learn Fourier series, something which works, some simple understanding. As time goes on, I think newer generations of students in physics do get better quality mathematical training. But I am stuck, as you know, in 1956. There were not treatments to. So, what are the two things that come up which one has to take attention to? Convergence of, I will write it and then I will briefly explain it. There are two aspects which I would like to briefly describe with you. Now, what I will imagine is the following: that I have a complex vector space of infinite dimension. I assume we have this, and we have just remembered what we mean by saying it is infinite dimensional, and I will say with positive definite scalar product, inner product. Now, we are close to what in mathematics is called Hilbert space. Yeah? Some question?
This because it's the infinite dimensional and we want positive definite inner product, we need convergence.
Exactly. Coming to that, right? That is the first problem. So, the common notation for Hilbert space is script H, and of course it was invented by Hilbert roughly about 100 years ago, a little over 100 years ago. Now what I want you to grasp is the following. You start with a vector space, you say what the vectors are and you sort of give a description of them, and then what you have is that for every vector in the vector space, you have a concept of its length. And what is it? We saw yesterday, it is the square root of the scalar product of x with itself. And now, if x is a non-zero vector, this will be strictly greater than 0. Positive definite scalar product. Now, when you have spaces of infinite dimension, you have to think about sequences. Sequences of vectors. And you have to think about what it means to converge. Does a sequence have a limit? You are probably familiar with this with real numbers and so also with complex numbers. These questions become very important in this context. So now, the point is the following. Suppose you have a sequence of vectors. This is given to you in that infinite dimensional vector space. So, this infinite sequence of vectors. So, you can imagine n, the index, goes over all the way up, no limit. Right? So, you are given a sequence. Let us also assume that this is a non-trivial sequence. What do I mean by that? Supposing that after the first 150 terms, 151, 152, all of them are 0. Or all of them are constant, number 150. Those I will say trivial. We will assume that as you keep going to larger and larger n, in each stage you get a new vector, not a repetition of what is already gone, etc. In a simple-minded way, I want you to assume this is a non-trivial sequence. Now, you take the nth vector in the sequence and the mth vector, subtract xm from xn. And then, so this is now a vector in your vector space. You can ask for the length of this vector. In this sense, what does it mean? Please tell me what I should write. What is the length of the vector xn in nth term in the sequence minus the mth term in the sequence? So it's a particular case of this. For x I must write this difference. So what? So that you are familiar with me. What is it? Root of xn. Yeah. xn minus xn. Scalar product with itself. Correct? Alright. So now we say this is a measure of the distance between the nth vector in the sequence and the mth vector in the sequence. Alright? So now we make a definition of convergence. We say a sequence of vectors such that the distances between the vectors in the sequence as you keep going towards infinity becomes smaller and smaller and smaller. Such a sequence is called Cauchy sequence. That's the word Cauchy. Alright. So now,
Sir,
yeah.
can it be not possible if it's jumping and then coming converging?
Yeah. Initially, it may go all over the place.
This definition means between any two vectors, the distance is reducing
Yeah.
as n is increasing.
Yeah.
But it could be possible that the numbers are scattered, but
Yeah.
the final result is a convergence.
If they are scattered forever, they are not a Cauchy sequence.
Okay.
So let me redefine. It's a very good point you have made. What do we mean by a Cauchy sequence? A sequence of vectors is a Cauchy sequence if the following happens. You give me any number, let us say 1 by 1000, 10 to the power minus 3. Then I can guarantee if you choose these vectors after vector number 750, anywhere after 750, this distance will be less than 1000. Then you say, that's not enough, I want it less than 10 to the minus 6. Then I say, after number 2000 you choose any two, the distance will be less than 10 to the minus 6. You decide how close you want the vectors to be. I will tell you how far you have to go in the sequence, after which they will always be less than what you specify. That avoids the scattering. Alright? So a sequence in which the distances between pairs of vectors become as small as you wish if you go far enough is called a Cauchy sequence.
So that is the definition if we choose an object in universe space and want to define inner product. This is the definition.
No. You have a complex vector space of infinite dimension. In that space you have defined a scalar product. Now because the dimension is infinite, we have to raise questions of sequences of vectors. What does it mean to say that a sequence converges? What does it mean to say that there is a limit and so on? These questions are not useful in for finite dimensions, but here they are very crucial. So I am driving to the concept of convergence. A sequence of vectors in the vector space will be said to be a Cauchy sequence if the distance between two vectors in the sequence becomes as small as you specify if I go far enough in the sequence. Now you may have a sequence which is not a Cauchy sequence, then I am not talking about that. For Cauchy sequences, we demand there should be a limit. It should be possible to say limit n going to infinity xn exists and it is some x which is in the vector. sequence is to say what kinds of infinite sequences of vectors should have limits. If a sequence is not a Cauchy sequence, we don't talk about a limit for that sequence. If a sequence is a Cauchy sequence, we would like to have a meaningful limit for that sequence of vectors. What it means is that in that case, we would want that there should be some x in the space such that your sequence, the vectors here become closer and closer and closer, indefinitely closer as you go far enough in the sequence. Okay, so this is a fact that real numbers have this property. Suppose you choose a sequence of real numbers, very easy to imagine, and suppose it is a Cauchy sequence. That is to say that the differences between pairs of real numbers become smaller and smaller and smaller as you go further and further and further. Such a sequence of real numbers has some real number as a limit. This is a fact, it's a property of the set of real numbers that we want to carry over to vector spaces in the infinite dimension. To actually clarify what you said about scattering and so on. So, suppose you take the sequence of numbers and the real number of this is a sequence of real numbers. For n equal to 1, this is equal to 2. For n equal to 2, it is 3 by 2. So on. Okay? Then for n equal to 3, it is 4 by 3, then 5 by 4, and so on. Is this a Cauchy sequence of real numbers? Take this one and take 1 plus 1 by n. Take the difference. 1 by n minus 1 by n. If n and m are sufficiently large, that will be as small as you desire. It is a Cauchy sequence of real numbers. Does it have a limit? 1. As n goes to infinity, this has a limit. Now, supposing that I take this sequence and after every million terms, I just add 10. Okay? Every millionth term in this sequence, I take this sequence and then first million terms, no change. Million plus 1, I just add 10 there. Then I go 2 million plus 1, I add another 10 there, but not in between. Will that be a Cauchy sequence? No. It won't have a limit either. So this is the kind of thing you are thinking of scattering. So we require a limit to exist only for sequences which have the Cauchy property, not for all sequences. I hope I tried to clarify this idea. So in the infinite dimensional vector space context, once you have defined an inner product, you demand that the vector space must be such that every Cauchy sequence must have a limit. If the space has the limit, you say that it has the completeness property. In qualitative terms, sequences which we feel should converge, in fact do converge. A space may be given as an infinite dimensional vector space, it may not have the completeness property. By mistake, you may have omitted to include a vector to which some sequence should actually have converged. So this can happen. So all this song and dance is to say the definition of a Hilbert space is a very delicate, sophisticated concept. It is not just an infinite dimensional complex vector space with a scalar product. It's much more than that. It has to have the completeness property. Concept of convergence of sequences must be meaningful, and sequences which ought to converge do converge. What are the sequences that ought to converge? Cauchy sequences. Only those. For every Cauchy sequence, if there is a limit within your space, only then you give it the name Hilbert space. Yeah.
See, I had this question.
Yeah.
You take any function, then you can expand it in a Fourier series on a
yeah,
basis.
yeah,
So that will be a countable infinity.
yeah.
Whereas you could also have written it in terms of e raised to ikx, which would be uncountable infinity.
No, the first case,
Just,
function on what domain?
no, let's say some wave function psi of x.
What is the range of x? That's what it is.
Say particle in a box minus 1.
What's the range of x? Minus to plus infinity.
No, x is minus 1 to plus 1.
Ah, finite.
Huh.
Okay, okay.
So you could have written it as in terms of sines and cosines.
A discrete series of sines and
Yes.
cosines. Yeah, sure.
You could also have written in terms of e raised to ikx.
But then that k would be discrete also. That's why I asked what is the range of x.
No, okay, maybe the example was wrong. What I'm really trying to say is,
Yeah,
when can you get a countable basis in an infinite dimensional vector
yeah,
space?
that's pretty sophisticated. You are now pushing me to the edge of my domain of knowledge. You push me a little more, I'll fall over. I will be destroyed. I don't know about you. But I will try to answer your question. Please don't forget it, I will come back to it. So, what I want you to appreciate is that the concept of a infinite dimensional complex vector space in scalar product which forms a Hilbert space has to have this property. Sequences which we all agree ought to converge will converge. The space should contain the limits of all its Cauchy sequences. That is the important thing. Alright, so that is one fact. So, just keep that in mind. If the vector space is finite dimensional, this is always true, you don't have to impose it as a separate condition, but you must impose it in the infinite dimensional space. Okay, now, if you come to page 13 of the note, it will start answering the question which you just asked me. The simplest example of a, oh by the way, Hilbert space as a name is used also for finite dimension. So we say two-dimensional Hilbert space, nothing wrong, but the completeness is a trivial property in that case. So now my focus is on infinite dimension. The first non-trivial example of an infinite dimensional Hilbert space is called little L2. That is a technical name for it, written like this. What does it consist of? It consists of, it is vectors in this vector space are of the following kind: a sequence of complex numbers all the way from 1 to infinity. Infinite sequence of complex numbers. And then we say that we will define the norm of x in this way. Sum of the modulus squared of the components of x all the way up to infinity. But now, if you take an arbitrary sequence, who knows whether that sum is finite or infinite? We impose a condition. This should be finite.
Less than.
Huh?
Less than.
Less than infinite. It should add up to something finite. So this little L2 is the first example in mathematics when they teach about Hilbert space. Is the first example. It consists of, you can say, complex vectors with infinitely many components. So now this is a discrete example. But you don't allow all imaginable sequences. You allow only those sequences xn for which this expression is finite. Then it is in the Hilbert space. If you have a sequence for which this series diverges, it is not in the Hilbert space. That's very important. Now, it is a matter of proof, and this is certainly not trivial. This is a complete vector space. If you take a sequence, I got out all the material, if you take a Cauchy sequence in this little L2, it is a matter, theorem to be proved, and it is not trivial, that there will be a limit. And the limit will also be in L2. So this is a Pakka Hilbert space. It has the completeness. Other things can also be shown. If you take two vectors in L2, the scalar product of the two vectors will be, as you might expect, xn star yn all the way from 1 to infinity. This will also be finite. This is something that can be proved. Actually, this is obvious from the Cauchy-Schwarz inequality for infinity. Now I will come to other examples of Hilbert spaces. So this is a discrete case. This is called little L2. Okay, that's a brand name for this. So this is known to be complete. Every sequence of infinite component vectors which should converge by our criterion in fact converges, and the limit is also there. That is very important. As I say, it is not easy. It's not a trivial matter. In fact, I don't remember the proof. I had studied the proof or learned it 50 years ago. If you ask me now to reproduce it, I can't. It takes some amount of effort. Now I come to the other aspect. In such spaces, when we now want to look at linear operators, here's some comment, please. Tell me, ask me.
Suppose that if there is this function fx is equal to x plus 1 upon x.
X is a real variable. Here we are talking of discrete sequences. So what is a, you want to look at a function f of x equal to
X plus 1 upon x.
Yeah. Yeah, so what is the question?
Is it lies what in what with vector space?
Huh?
It is lies in the vector space.
Your question is not fully meaningful. What is the x in this expression?
If x is what belong to the vector space.
So x itself is an element of this space. So it means it's an infinite sequence. So what do you mean by 1 by x? It's not meaningful. Don't think of this x as a real number or even a complex number. A vector here is not a single number, it's an infinite set of numbers. I want you to appreciate, what is this x? It is this whole sequence. It is set x1, x2, x3, x4 without any ending. So this is not a meaningful. Huh?
We can take what if fxn is equal to xn plus 1 upon xn.
Okay. So what is the
Where n is what
n equals 1, 2, 3, etc. Just on the way, nobody says every xn should be non-zero. Nobody says that. Whenever there is a vector x for which one of its components vanishes, there will be trouble. So this will not be well defined. That's a simple point. This is a cheap point. But what is the purpose of this definition? What is f supposed to represent? In your mind, what is the purpose of this definition? You will have to tell me.
I just wanted to see that whether this is what a convergence or not. It is belong to the word vector space.
So this expression does not seem to me to be directly relevant to the convergence question, as far as I can see. Okay. Now I come to features which you have to deal with in the process of defining linear operators in such spaces. So what I will do is take a very simple example with this little l. imagine that you try to define a linear operator A on L2 as follows. What is the attempt? This is equation 60 on page 13. You say, you start with a vector, sorry, it's an equality sign. Start with a vector in a vector space, and suppose you say, I would like to define the operator A by this formula. Alright? Is this a well-defined idea? Does it make sense? Is this acceptable, or are there some problems with this definition? This is what I wanted to appreciate. Suppose you start with a vector in your little L2, what does it mean? It means this series converges. Otherwise, X would not be in our space. Now, is the result always in the space? Or is it possible it will sometimes not be in the space? What your,
N goes to infinity.
yeah. So, what you are given is this series is converging. You are given that X is in the vector space, so this is finite. Does this imply Ax, which you are trying to define in this space, also in L2? It's a question we have to ask. That is sum n equals 1 to infinity n squared mod x squared? This is the question I am asking. For this attempted definition to be meaningful, we would require that this series also converge. It in general will not. What it shows is that you might have an operator which is of interest to you, but you may not be able to define it on all vectors of the Hilbert space. Each operator which you try to define, and many operators in physics are of this kind, may only be definable only on part of the Hilbert space. That means for most operators that one deals with in physics in infinite dimensional cases, each operator has a domain of definition. You can't take any vector in the Hilbert space and say, I will apply A to it and I will get a result which is also in the Hilbert space. It may not happen. There may be restrictions on what vectors you can apply the operator to. This is called the problems of domain. On the other hand, you might have a situation where an operator is definable everywhere. I'll give you another example. Suppose I try to define an operator capital B by saying that it takes a sequence xn to a new sequence in the way I have defined now, divided by a converging term. This has no problem. If the starting vector is in little L2, surely this will be even better convergent. This will also be in L2. For an operator like B which I have written, there is no domain problem. For an operator like this which I tried to define, there is a domain problem. So, the general, is that Cauchy? It is. So, such operators for which you must choose the domain carefully are called kinetic energy is unbounded in any non-trivial case. As I said, momentum, angular momentum, all of these are unbounded. Position is unbounded. Okay? So, don't think that I am doing something very, very esoteric. Of course, most of the time, physics students are not aware of these things, problems of definition of operators in infinite dimensions. We do calculations, do derivations, just praying that nothing will go wrong. And most of the time, we are saved. I don't know by whom, but we don't run into, I think it is just physicists' intuition, their understanding of the physics of a situation which saves them from possible mathematical disasters. Okay, so there are two ideas I have tried to convey to you. When you go to vector spaces of infinite dimension with a scalar product, first is the very definition of spaces of that kind may be the completeness. An infinite dimensional vector space which is not complete is not a Hilbert space, but there is a mathematical procedure called making it complete. If it does not contain the limits of sequences which should converge, you add those limits. So make it a little larger. That is one. Second, when you want to consider operators on such spaces, then you have to deal very carefully with operators of the unbounded type, those for which definition of the domain is very important. So I just give one or two examples. So this little L2 is the simplest example of a non-trivial infinite dimensional Hilbert space. In most physical problems in quantum mechanics, we deal with Hilbert spaces not of this discrete sequence type, but of the involving integrations of wave functions. So those spaces are generally described as capital L2. And on page 13, equation 33, I have given a lot of physically interesting examples. So I will just concentrate on one of them. I may write it in various ways. Capital L2 this capital L is an indication that you are dealing with, let us say, Schrodinger wave functions of a continuous variable. And the superscript 2 means square integrable. Like little L2, the little L means discrete sequence. Superscript 2 means that the sum of squares must be convergent. So, how do we define this? In quantum mechanics, this is very, very relevant. Suppose you have a point particle which has to run on a circle. Alright? So, its position classically is described by an angle variable theta which goes from 0 to 2 pi. In quantum mechanics, it will consist of, it will be described by wave functions psi of theta, which are complex Schrodinger wave functions, let us say, with the following definition. That the scalar product of psi with itself shall be defined by an integral. And we make a demand. A wave function psi of x is to be accepted only if this integral d theta 0 to 2 pi mod psi theta squared has a finite value. If you choose some function psi of theta for which this integral diverges, it does not belong to it. So, strictly speaking, if you want to use this space to describe the quantum mechanical states of a particle running around on a circle, you must only choose wave functions for which this integral is finite. So this is a continuous variable analog to the definition in the case of little L. And this, I think, answers one of the questions you raised earlier this morning.
Yes, no?
Yeah, earlier today you were asking the discrete case
No,
was.
no, what I was asking is, what is the condition that the space should satisfy? So that a countable basis can be
Okay. Yeah, that I can only give a technical answer, but I can't give any proof or anything. This Hilbert space has a countable basis, countable autonomous set. Most of the Hilbert spaces we deal with in physical problems are of that kind. Even if they are described using Schrodinger wave functions which depend on continuous variables, they are always of the kind where a discrete orthonormal basis can be introduced. Such Hilbert spaces have a name, they are called separable Hilbert spaces. Now in mathematics, there are also non-separable, but as far as I know, they have not played any important role in it. As far as I know. Not even in quantum field theory. It's like this. Separable case is all that we need in physical situations. For them, there is always a discrete orthonormal basis, always possible.
So if that is the case, then why in quantum mechanics one uses the Fourier transform and so on? Why not always go for discrete?
Well, the physical meaning of the variable is important. Suppose you look at this case. If this is physically describing the motion of a point particle on a circle, our classical understanding of this problem says position in physical space for this particle is given by a variable theta, which is a continuous variable. If you were to say, I will not use this description, I will straight away go to a discrete basis, you will have destroyed the concept of this position in physical three-dimensional space. Now, all our intuition works in terms of physical space. Suppose you have, instead of circle, suppose you have a particle moving on a line, minus to plus infinity. The physics of the situation says, classically, at any given time, the particle could be anywhere along the line. Go to quantum mechanics, you have a Schrodinger wave function on the line. But the fact that the classical system had a certain physical meaning, that remains with you. You don't throw it away. But the whole notion of position along the line would be destroyed, or it will be very much hidden, or not at all evident, if you do all calculations and all manipulations with a discrete orthonormal basis.
Then you know what, see, here you, as you said, you could have taken a discrete basis.
You can. Mathematically it is there.
So it's a countable infinite.
Yeah.
But you are taking an uncountable basis. So in
No, where is the basis here? Where is the uncountable basis?
No, what I was saying is, suppose there is a situation where you could have taken a countable basis.
Yeah.
But many times we land up taking an uncountable basis.
We don't.
We don't.
Uncountable basis would mean it's a non-separable Hilbert space. And as I say, most all physical problems, we don't deal with such Hilbert space. In this description of this Hilbert space, we are not using an uncountable basis. There is no basis so far shown here. I want you to appreciate this point.
So what I was really talking about is you take any psi of x and you write a Fourier transform for it.
Yeah,
That is a basis expansion.
no, it's not.
It is not a basis.
No, because momentum is an unbounded operator. It has it's technical. It's a continuous eigenvalues. Its eigenfunctions do not exist in the bona fide mathematical sense. They exist in the physicist's way of doing things, which is, from mathematics point of view, illegal. We talk of ideal eigenfunctions, ideal eigenvectors. They don't exist. It does not mean we have an uncountable basis. That I want to clarify with as much strength as I can. Would you like to add something?
We cannot take momentum basis for calculations.
Sure, but that basis is a wrong use of the mathematical term basis.
Yeah, but then we say it's complete in the sense of delta function completely.
Sure. So that's why they are called ideal eigenfunctions, ideal eigenvectors. They do not lie in the Hilbert space. This I want you to
Yeah, but
Please accept with folded hands, I'm telling you, you will understand it later. But this momentum eigenfunctions do not belong to Hilbert space, period. But physicists have got used to it. They use a notation which makes them think that it lies in Hilbert space, but they don't. But we know how to be careful in our calculations so that this illegal step does not lead to further illegalities. Okay. Now, this whole idea of continuous momentum basis, delta function, all these things were introduced by Dirac. He did this in the year period 1927, 26 to 1930, and he wrote a book, Principles of Quantum Mechanics, in 1930, in which he used all these notions. They were invented by him. The whole physics community uses his methods and are very comfortable. The very next year, John von Neumann, a mathematician, wrote a book. What is it called? Mathematical Foundations of Quantum Mechanics. And you must read. It's a beautifully written book, but it is very demanding. In the preface, he says, Dirac has written a book on the principles of quantum mechanics which can scarcely be equal for its elegance and beauty. Alright. And then he goes on to say, but the mathematics used by Dirac does not even fulfill the relaxed conditions of rigor which physicists are used to. And he tears Dirac to pieces. He says, this delta function never should be used, it makes no sense in mathematics. And then he criticizes the mathematical ideas Dirac uses very, very strongly. It's an interesting education, you must read it, just the preface. This was in 19, when did he write? 31, 32, something like that, von Neumann. In 1950s, as Kaushik would bear witness, the great French mathematician Laurent Schwartz showed that if you expand your mathematical ideas and definitions, you can make good sense of the Dirac delta function. And so, what von Neumann had criticized as very unacceptable mathematical ideas became respectable in mathematics. But momentum eigenfunctions, even to this day, they have not been made respectable in the mathematical sense. We use it in the sense of distribution theory. We talk as though it was a continuous basis for Hilbert space. But it's not. This I want to. So, plane waves. The Fourier transform, what does it mean? It takes a function psi of x and writes it as an integral over k. Please do not think of that as an expansion of psi of x in a well-defined basis in Hilbert space. Because I guarantee to you, every meaningful basis is necessarily of a discrete, enumerated kind, separable. And using, so I can put it this way, the theory of Fourier integrals is very well defined in classical mathematics. We take those results for quantum mechanics and try to put it into this Hilbert space language, but we try to use these ideas of eigenvectors and eigenfunctions where we should be more careful. So, if you can do all your calculations of quantum mechanics without falling into error, well and good. That's what most physicists learn to do. But should not go so far as to say that they have a continuous basis. That we should. That there you have fallen over the precipice.
How do we determine errors if it does not, the results are not in Hilbert basis? But if we take momentum eigenvectors, do some calculations, and if the results are not in as specified Hilbert basis, how do we say that it is right result or wrong result? It does not have any analog with the...
Good question. So, one way of doing it is to say, I don't know if some books in quantum mechanics do it that way. There were some lectures by Lowe on scattering theory in the 1960s which does this. The physically well-defined approach is to say there is really no such thing as an eigenstate of momentum for a particle in quantum mechanics. Imagine a free particle. Really, physically, there is no such thing as a momentum eigenstate. All you can get is a wave pattern. The momentum eigenstate, it's a plane wave is what we would say, it is not normalizing. So it's not in the Hilbert space. The best you can do is to have a small range of momentum values giving you a wave function which describes a particle in a small region of space. That is called a wave packet. That is a legitimate element of Hilbert space. Position. There is no such thing as a position eigenvector in the strict sense. The position of a particle along the line in quantum mechanics can never be asserted with complete accuracy. You can only have very narrow scale, but finite, so that it is normalizable. What does normalizable mean? This kind of thing should be converged, right? So one has to be practical also. You can't be ideal in the world. So what I would like to say is that physicists, when they learn quantum mechanics, I would say, as new generations come, you must tell the students that there are aspects of the mathematics which we must at least be aware of. We must not be in ignorance. But we may learn to do calculations in a simple-minded way. Then, I think it is an intuition that grows with your use of your understanding of classical mechanics, and then electromagnetic theory and so on and so forth, which tells you whether the calculation you are doing will ultimately be alright. But you must have that confidence, that you must be able to smell trouble, even though you may not be able to get rid of it. That sensitivity should be there. So, I don't say let us not use the methods which Dirac has taught in physicists. We should use them because they are very, very compact and efficient. But they should not hide from us the fact that there are mathematical aspects here, very important mathematical ideas. Okay, so I think I've done too much philosophy, not enough physics. So I'll just take 5 more minutes and tell you something about this. Here is the set of Schrödinger wave functions you would introduce to describe the motion of a particle in quantum mechanics if it was running on a circle. On the other hand, supposing you wanted to describe the motion of a particle in one dimension anywhere along the real axis. So, what kind of wave function will you use? You will use functions which have complex values and defined over the entire real line, and then you would say an allowed wave function, an allowed Schrödinger wave function is one for which this integral minus to plus infinity should be finite. Okay? So, it is this condition which the mathematician would always insist upon. Otherwise, you are not dealing with a Hilbert space L2 over the real axis. The physicist would say, yeah, we know this, but we will, when it is convenient, when we are not going to make any serious error, we will use a momentum eigenstate. We will behave as though this is a possible Schrödinger wave function. What is the physical meaning? It's a wave function describing this particle having a precise momentum. T is the eigenvalue of momentum. But put this in here, the integral diverges. So this is the point I was telling you up to now. So I want you to be aware. Classical Fourier theory uses expression of psi of x as an integral over these. All that we can borrow. It's all legitimate mathematics. Whether in quantum mechanics, this is a permissible physical state. There we have to be. Right? We have to say this is a state in an ideal sense, in a limiting sense. And if you want me to be rigorous, yes, I will be rigorous. I will say You can never have a particle with a very well-defined momentum. All you can have is a wave packet in which you have integration over some small range of momentum values, and this you can make sure obeys this condition. Alright, so it will be a wave packet. You can make the momentum as well defined as you like, but not infinitely precise. So this is a kind of precaution that you have to take. Alright, so let me come back here. This question of domains of definition, this I wanted to say something. A natural operator to introduce, after all, for momentum in quantum mechanics, it is represented on Schrodinger wave function as I minus I h cross d by d mod, right? So differential operators are very important. So go back to this case. Can we regard this as a well-defined operator on such wave functions? The question is the following. Suppose psi of theta is in this space. Can I say then this is also in that space? This is the question. What does this mean if A, the differential operator, is to be applicable to psi of theta? What it means is two conditions. One, psi of theta, it should be possible to differentiate. You may start with a psi of theta which belongs to the space but which cannot be differentiated. Such functions exist. Now, most physicists, we are innocent of this kind of knowledge. These things were functions which are continuous everywhere. I don't know if you have ever heard of this. It is really weird. There exist functions which are continuous everywhere but cannot be differentiated anywhere.
Fractal?
Huh?
Example?
I suppose so. I don't know. Something like that. I don't know this subject very well, but I know that there is a great discovery in mathematics. It was not very long ago. In the late 19th century, the great mathematician called Weierstrass, one of the first people to actually construct such functions. I want you to know all the great mathematicians before Weierstrass, Lagrange, Laplace, all of them, they were as naive as us physicists today. They would take any function and assume without discussion, yeah, I can differentiate it, I can integrate it, and so on. Standards of rigor in mathematics were very low until the later part of the 19th century. And this man, Weierstrass, was the first one to construct examples of functions which are continuous. Now, everybody knows the epsilon delta definition of continuous. He constructed functions which are continuous everywhere but cannot be differentiated anywhere. It's very hard to picture, but as you say, infinitely jagged.
What these snowflake curves and
Yeah, things of that kind. Those are more common in the recent literature. The discovery was made around the 1870s or 1880s. Professor Kaushik would tell you. So, what I am saying here now is, for the wave function to be such that you can apply this operator, two conditions have to be obeyed. It must be possible to differentiate. This is condition number one. Condition number two, after you differentiate it, you will get some function. It must belong to the space. Therefore, there are two kinds of conditions when you deal with operators on such spaces. And let me tell you, I am not doing very abstract mathematics for its own sake. I am not able to do that. But quantum mechanics leads you to such consideration. So, there is a problem. How shall we define the domain of this operator? What are the wave functions psi of theta of this kind to which A can be applied? You have to decide. It's a matter of definition of the operator. To give an operator A does not mean just writing formally minus I d by d theta. Along with this, you must say, here is the operation and here is where you should apply it. That is it. And now, so I just hopefully motivated for you the idea that in typically all quantum mechanical problems where differentiation operators appear, the question of domain is a relevant question. The other point is that why do we deal with differential operators? It is because they describe momentum. Momentum is as important as position for physical problems. In this problem, d by d theta represents actually angular momentum. Rate mass times angular velocity. There, d by dx would be is the linear momentum. So, it is only natural that in physical problems in quantum mechanics, operators of differentiation are going to play a role. So, once you know that, problem of domain of definition comes in. So now, what I want you to appreciate is, there are many, this is something which Professor Mani also reminded me the other day. For a well-defined Hilbert space, we must have a completeness property, as I said in the morning. Every Cauchy sequence must converge. So it turns out that is a very sophisticated condition. What kinds of Schrodinger wave functions should we allow so that we have a completeness property? Well, when you teach integration in the first time, I don't know which class it is taught.
11th.
Yeah. This idea of Riemann's definition of integration, where does it come anywhere in mathematics? I don't know. Second year in math, pure mathematics. Physics student may not.
Pure physics student is may not be.
May not even see it. Okay.
Maths course.
It comes in mathematics course. What I want you to appreciate is that this concept of completeness, which I tried to describe earlier today morning, tells you that allowed wave functions are not just those for which this integral is finite when interpreted as a Riemann integral. There is a much more basic definition of integration called Lebesgue integration. He was a French mathematician, and the concept of Lebesgue integration was created by him around 1910, 1920. Because for you, you will say, oh, it was 100 years ago. For me, it seems more recent. So I just want to tell you, there are developments in mathematics which are important for quantum mechanics, which are of fairly recent origin. So there is a sophisticated idea of integration called Lebesgue integration. It goes beyond Riemann integration. And the consequence is that the spaces of wave functions that we use in quantum mechanics have to be Lebesgue square integral. It's not enough to live with the Riemann idea of integral. We have to go beyond that. But I don't mind at this stage in my life making a confession. I don't know Lebesgue integration too well. And I am happy to hear you also don't know it. But I don't know.
There is only one. Riemann integrable is Lebesgue integrable, right?
Sure.
And
Sure.
there are Lebesgue integrables which are not.
Not. That is why it goes significantly beyond the Riemann notion of integrability. What I would like to know is later generations of physics students, for example in our country, in some of our better institutions, are they aware of these points? This is what I want. If you and I continue to teach them, it is like a blind leading the blind. Right? Okay, so this is an important thing. Maybe one day Professor Kaushik will tell you a little idea of what Lebesgue integral is. So, what I want you to appreciate, I will stop this discussion at this point. I just want to tell you the pages 13 to 19 of these notes. Please have a look at them. The things that are done here are the following. I have said so far, when you are dealing with such operators in quantum mechanics, it is important to state the domain of definition. Even that is not adequate. Many cases, I have given examples, not only should you say the function must have such and such differentiability properties, one has to add boundary condition. An operator, this is a very formal definition, it is not a complete definition. You must give the domain and you must give boundary condition. An operator is completely defined, everything is under control, only those two items of information are given. So in those pages up to page 19, I have given you examples. What else have I done on those pages? I have tried to give a simple-minded derivation of Fourier transformation by a limiting process. I have done it in 1 dimension, in 2 dimensions, and in 3 dimensions. So I hope sometime, since these notes are with you, you will get a chance to have a look at them. And when you are dealing with the Fourier transformation in 2 and 3 dimensions, not only can you describe everything using Cartesian variables, but you can use spherical polar, radial and r theta or r theta phi. So the ordinary Cartesian Fourier transformation for many physics problems, scattering theory, electromagnetic theory and so on, and quantum scattering theory also, rewriting ordinary Cartesian Fourier transformation in other coordinate systems, r and theta, r theta phi, is very, very useful. They are very elegant formulas and we use them for physics a great deal. And among all of these, I just want to mention one formula. It is formula 90 on page 19. I like that formula very much. It is called Bauer's formula. I don't know who Bauer was or when it was first derived, but it's a beautiful formula. Can you see equation 90? In the language of quantum, loose physics language of quantum mechanics, the left hand side is a momentum eigenfunction. The wave function is definite linear momentum. This formula expresses a state with definite linear momentum as a linear combination of states with angular momentum, kinetic energy and angular energy. So that is why I like that formula very much. It ties together so many of the so-called special functions of mathematical physics. So let me stop here. I have gone over time today. I will start tomorrow with some group theory. Okay.